Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Library of Games Log in Audio Out podcast. My name is Hugo, and I am with your co-host, Taylor. Say hi, Taylor.
Hello.
And today I'm with a recurring guest, Max. Say hi.
Hey, what's up, guys? I'm happy to be back.
Awesome. So today is a very special episode for our podcast because we are going to be talking about the topics of storytelling in video games. And the reason why this is special is because we're going to be focusing on this topic on another event for later, if anyone who's recurring or even watching this after this is at event in Chi-Teen Lit Fest. But we can get more on that later. So, back on the topic at hand, storytelling in video games always has a powerful dynamic. It is one of the key points of why people play video games now. It was a key point in why people play video games back then to some extent. So I think I kind of want to start off with Taylor on this one because I do think you play a lot more narrative-driven games than you do with multiplayer-centric. So I think it'd be a great way to start you off with it.
Narrative games are near and dear to my heart. Like you said, probably the majority of games that I play have strong narrative or are story rich. I think I'm particularly drawn to storytelling in video games because it's so unique. I mean, books, movies, theater are all, kind of similar in a lot of respects with the way that narrative evolves and flows, and there's a lot of differences in story structure, but story structure in a video game is so entirely different and unique. I think that's often why you don't see good adaptations of video games in movies, because it's not an easy kind of narrative structure to sort of port over to another medium.
I think it's only been like one or two successful attempts at that.
Yeah, it doesn't really work. And so much of this is really built around this idea that Jim G, who is this really awesome writer and academic who writes about video games and media, and he came up with this theory or description of how, he came up with a lot of descriptions of how storytelling works in video games, but I think the thing that I'm most drawn to is something called embodied stories. So it's this idea that you are, when you're playing a game, playing as a character, playing as another person. Now, this isn't true in all narrative video games, but I think in my personal favorites, that's the case. So you have to put yourself in someone else's shoes and play as that character. And kind of interpret the world and figure out actions based on what that character would do. And that is incredibly powerful to me. When you're reading a book, you're kind of passive. You're letting the story happen kind of around you. And in a video game, you're making choices and decisions and really living that story, hence the term embodied stories. And what's really interesting about this, it makes us make different kinds of choices in games than we may make in real life, or we're sometimes surprised by the choices we make in video games. You think, I'm not a person who would ever make a decision like this, and yet you do it in a video game. If you look at something like The Walking Dead, the first season, I was so surprised at a lot of things that I did in that game. And I sort of ended up questioning, what are my morals? That's a particular game that will take you through the ethical ringer. And I think is a really great example of this, where you're living it. You're living the game. And if you're playing a really good narrative game, you're immersed in it. And, decisions, actions, story beats affect you really deeply because, you're in some ways living it.
Amazing. All right. What about Max?
I think I agree with a lot of what Taylor said. There's something about the setting of games that just elevates narratives generally. we talked about the dynamic of video games going to movies and why it's so hard to translate in that direction. And I think it's because the experience at the end of the day is just downgraded. Whereas if you look at examples of, I don't know of many, I can't think of an example of a movie turning into a video game off the top of my head. But if we're going to go with like stories like books being turned into video games, we can look at anything related to Tom Clancy, the Metro series. There's just an element of putting it into a world space where you have such dynamic decision over that world space that like I think elevates that experience a lot, and especially I think what Taylor made a very interesting point about how sometimes even being forced to be a different character, and it lets you live more into the main character's life than if you're reading a book,
And I think it's great. And it's funny. You couldn't think of any good examples of video games turning into movies. I can think of like the two good examples. I can think of a few bad ones.
No, I'm sorry. I meant movies turning into video games.
Oh, my apologies. Oh, my. Yeah, no. I think that part is actually a little bit harder. I think I've rarely ever seen that done, and I think that's just the whole sense of like a franchise trying to translate that into a video game is difficult. I think the best example I've ever seen that attempt was like, and hear me out, SpongeBob. and that is
SpongeBob
just
Battle for Bikini Bottom.
Yep, that is like that is, and obviously it takes away from storytelling. And I'm just gonna this is my one tangent for this time. It's the best use of a copyright for a franchise, and they use it to advertise a movie, and I think it handled great. That's my only best example.
Yeah. And like the Walking Dead is, adaptation of a comic / television series. But what's interesting when you say that, I'm like, there's all the kind of like shovelware games that are put out to promote like kids movies and like all of that kind of junk. But when you look at things like the Telltale games, like there was the Walking Dead, Game of Thrones, Fables based on a comic, they all tell completely different stories than the story that was told in the comic or TV show. They're set in the similar world, but they tell a completely new narrative, which I think is really smart about all of those games. One of the big things with narrative in games is that, as Max was saying, like you're getting this much more expansive experience. You're exploring a world. And with that, pacing is so different. In movies, you get your like 3-act structure. And in video games, you get a kind of like weird story arc.
You're not really supposed to know when exactly things are supposed to happen per se. Because a climax could happen in the middle of the game, could happen right at the last 5 minutes. Or it could not even happen and just kind of like be transitioned to like a sequel per se.
And if you're playing an open world game, it's whatever order you decide to do things in.
Like even the structure of those Telltale games, they have like multiple because the traditional story is that sort of like 3 acts. Like in just a single episode, you get like a little bit like a miniature like 3-act section, and then those all like combined into one like mega story, for lack of a better term, right? Yeah. And like it just gives more time to like flesh out like a longer narrative at the pace that you personally want when you're experiencing it, right?
And that's like one of the biggest advantages I think video games have over films for storytelling. Is I think of this one. What's the Hideo Kojima game? Death Stranding. There you go. Aside from what that is, I think that game felt like a movie. But I think it was a movie that kind of took a long time to kind of progress and get the wheels going. But the payoff was astronomical.
That's a game where, so I haven't finished it. It's the only game that I play on my PS4, and I like never play my PS4 because it's in a room that we just like don't use. Anyway, I will go back to it at some point. But I had that feeling that it felt more like a movie with a lot of cutscenes with tons of exposition. But I also feel like that game did a really good job with its world building and leaving clues and hints as to what this world is about in the environment. That's one of the things I absolutely love about video games. I love just exploring and finding things in games. You look at the BioShock franchise, like that's an amazing example of that, where so much is revealed to you about the kind of the history of the world, the past of characters, that adds so much to the narrative just when you're like searching around and taking your time to explore. And I absolutely love that about video games. And I wish Death Stranding had like trusted itself a little bit more to like just let that, tell the narrative instead of like 30-minute cutscenes every like 15 minutes.
I never got to play Death Stranding, but I think elements of like, the generally like I think people like when you think about good storytelling, there's the concept of show, not tell, right?
Yeah.
And I think video games, more so than any other medium of storytelling, have the opportunity of doing the show, not tell, because books are just words. You can have pictures, like there can be pictures in books, but generally it's very limited. Graphic novels are a thing. Movies, they can show you things, but there's still such a limited amount of time generally in a movie to really do the show not tell aspect of storytelling. But video games allow you to be in a world space. You can just be exploring and you'll find a random note, or in BioShock you find those voice recordings, and while technically that is telling, it is also showing, because it requires like that you to go out and search for those things. It's not those, I feel like that stuff isn't forced on you, but it's for you to develop the world yourself if you choose to like look for things like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I love how you mentioned where a lot of people they rely on both novels or books for them it's just kind of words. It's hard to paint a portrayal. And to me, that makes me think of, well, no, video games can actually change that, because there is a genre of video games that essentially are words, and those are visual novels. I'm thinking games like Phoenix Wright, Ace Attorney, Danganronpa, Doki Doki Literature Club, just simple stuff like that, or even games that are just text heavy, which I'm assuming like Disco Elysium, maybe? I don't know, question mark?
Yeah, Disco Elysium is really text heavy.
Mm-hmm. So it's games like that where I feel like dialogue matters, and sometimes you're not even given voice clips. You have to read it yourself, and I like to think of it like they treat the player like little kids, like, oh, they think it's a game, but reality, you're just reading. No, and I think it's smart, because the whole point of video games and as an entertainment as a medium entirely is it's supposed to be fun. You're supposed to enjoy it, not think twice about it. And if reading isn't your forte, maybe the visual novel in terms of video game can help you, because it's essentially just a book with more pictures. But no, that's how I got into it, because I think I got into Ace Attorney out of nowhere. I thought, oh, it's a cool puzzle game. Then I realized, wait a minute, this is a visual novel. I'm just reading the entire time.
Yeah, I've never really thought a lot about video games that are text heavy like that as possibilities for reluctant readers, people who think like they don't read or like to read. And I feel like, again, it's like a question of pacing and having control over the world. So like in Phoenix, right, you're making choices, decisions, like solving problems.
Mysteries.
Yeah, mostly solving problems. Which adds like it's interactive. Like I think a lot of these you could visual novels, like just consider them interactive storytelling, and there is a little bit of tension, I think, in video game world of like what's the difference between video games and interactive storytelling, as we're starting to see more sort of like choose your own adventure kind of movie type games. And then, now we're also seeing like the choose your own adventure episodes of TV shows on Netflix. So I think that the lines are getting a little blurred. kind of on the edges of the video game industry and, other forms of visual storytelling?
I think I have an interesting perspective on the like people who don't think that they are readers, but then can play something like a visual novel, or even just be reading the text in a video game, and it can sort of not trick you into reading, but because I think generally people who think they're not readers just haven't found a story that can capture their interest more so than anything.
Yeah.
They relate reading more so to like schoolwork, and not to undercount the importance of stuff like that, but it's boring. It can be boring for people sometimes, It can be hard for people to motivate themselves to do those things if their interests aren't captured. Me personally, growing up, I had very bad dyslexia and a bad lazy eye. I would go to the optometrist, and when I'd be reading, like they have this like goggles on where I could read through them, and it's like recording my eyes. I'd be reading, and these would be my eyes. My right eye would be staying just fine, and the left eye would like veer off somewhere else, like completely. And so reading was a struggle for me up to like 8th grade. I was reading like 2 or 3 grade levels below what I should have been at for CPS standards. I also had bad hand-eye coordination as well. And video games were actually things that were secret therapy for those things. Because video games required me to have better hand-eye coordination, so I would not have to be looking down at the controller constantly while pressing buttons, and that led to me even be able to now type like without looking at a keyboard mostly. And reading, some of the first games I grew up playing were Pokemon games. Those aren't necessarily narrative-heavy games.
Yeah.
However,
yeah.
there's lots of text to read, and small text as well. And these were things that had a legitimate effect on my life, and sort of were secret because I went through hours and hours of eye therapy as a kid, and I hated it. It felt torturous to me because I would leave and my eyes would hurt. Like it felt like that because as a little kid, that stuff doesn't make sense to you because it's like exercises to force your eyes to work together. And sometimes I would notice some of that after playing games, but to me it didn't matter as much because I was having fun doing it. And so this stuff does have like a very measurable effect, and I can say that, especially for me, it had an insane effect on my life, and like in relation to that topic of like, it's not that you don't like reading, it's not that you're necessarily not good at these things, it's you haven't found something to capture you. And if you can find that thing to capture your interest, then you can sort of overcome that thing that you might think is one of your Achilles heels, for lack of a better term. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I think it's great. So now it's just I feel like we're going into a bit of a tangent of a different type of topic for video games. To go back on terms of storytelling, what would you guys think is your best form of a video game telling its narrative? And I think I can start off mine. Mine's going to be a place no one will ever really expect. Mine is Call of Duty. And
okay. No.
Explain yourself.
Explain yourself, please.
This is one of my most outlandish narratives I've ever tried to explore. So, everyone knows Call of Duty. It's the most generic first-person shooter game out there. Comes out every year. It's factory churned. Nothing crazy. But one day out of the blue, this was a company, Treyarch, that created a mode for one of their World War II games. It was a mode you had to unlock after beating the main story, which most video games of them have like a campaign, which is fine. Some are great, some are not. Not the point where I'm trying to get at here. What I enjoy is out of nowhere they unlock a secret mode, which is like, you fight in a zombie apocalypse per se. Where in this case, or in World War II, instead of fighting Nazis, you're fighting like Nazi zombies per se. And when that first kind of popped up, people were just kind of shocked, like, what is this? This wasn't advertised at all here. And then what people started realizing with this little extra game mode is that there was stories. There was a story on why this game mode happened, where and people didn't fully happen until like the next game afterwards, which is like, I guess, Call of Duty Black Ops, to where it had a zombie mode feature. And the fun thing about this game mode is that when you start off, you're just like, oh, you're entering the world, fight the zombies, survive for as long as you can. What it doesn't tell you is that there's a secret narrative you have to find and build. And the only way you find this story is by looking through little Easter eggs, where you get to find out, oh, what character are you? Oh, what exactly is the origin of the zombie apocalypse? And the only way to find it is through Easter eggs. And they're hidden in the most obscure places in the world. And I'm talking about like finding like a rabbit in like a table far off, or killing a certain amount of zombies in a certain fashion, or triggering certain events to create like a secret event happening. This started becoming a tradition for most of the games for Call of Duty from the game studio Treyarch. So much so where at first they were really like hiding it. Now they're also it gained so much popularity from the public that it's now kind of like the main centric point that, oh, each game that for Call of Duty comes out is the next chapter of the story, this everlasting story, because this story, it doesn't last through one game. Like the current story that I'm working on, it's still caught up, it's in the span of like 10 games. And before, they don't tell you what the story is. You have to build it yourself, and you have to face like 10 rounds of zombies, 20, 50, etc. And there's still more Easter eggs being found to this day on like the original maps, just for being told, hey, from developers, hey, there's a story here. It's your job to find it. And honestly, it's like, as a kid, that was the most rewarding thing in the world, because I felt like I was in charge of how the story went down, and it was like a puzzle you had to piece together and you wanted to know more of. And obviously, I think it's just a really unique take that I've never really seen any other game kind of replicate. But
interesting. I didn't know.
I actually understand what you're saying. I think there's a surprisingly high level like story in the Call of Duty Zombies modes through secret Easter eggs that the community has to unlock. I think that method of it is actually. I didn't realize where you were going when you said Call of Duty, but the moment you said Call of Duty Zombies, I was actually pretty on board with what you were talking. When you mentioned that specifically, I was reminded. I was like, yeah, there actually is like a surprisingly intense and high level story in that mode particularly,
and
more so than you would think.
And you brought the good point. The fact that it created a community where the story wasn't just built by one person. It was built through like one guy telling, it's like, hey, I think I found this. What do you think it means? Another guy, oh, I found this. It connects, and so forth and so forth. And so I don't know. There's just a community just theorizing, oh, what this story is. And it's gotten to really convoluted to a point where there's a little 6-year-old girl controlling zombies in the moon. It's really wild. I love it so much.
It's super wild.
I love it. But no, that's my choice if I would have to pick like the most unique form of storytelling. But have you guys thought about anything yet?
I can definitely think of a lot of examples of, I think, really great storytelling. A lot of them I've talked about on past episodes of the podcast, but I think a game that I haven't really talked about is Firewatch. It came out a few years ago, I think like 2016. Absolutely brilliant game. Often gets called a walking simulator. I hate that term for games. I think just let's not use it. But you may have heard of it.
All you do is really walk,
simulator. You do when you interact with the world, but I think more importantly, you're choosing your dialogue in the game. So the general premise of the game is you're playing as a man. There's a short introduction to the game that's without visuals that outlines the history of your relationship with your wife and what your marriage has been like. And it's revealed that she has early onset dementia, and she's in a care home, and you have decided to go take this job at a national forest, for the summer, being on Firewatch, taking care of things and like making sure there are no shenanigans happening in the national forest. It's a really beautiful game. And your dialogue choices throughout really define what your relationship has been like with your wife. So you're given a lot of options in your dialogue, and you're talking the whole time to a woman at the ranger station. So your dialogue choices reveal what your relationship has been like with your wife, how you feel about it, and also how you feel about the woman that you're talking to. So you're really like developing this relationship with this other woman, and then also reflecting on your relationship with your wife as you're going through and solving a kind of mystery out in the forest by yourself. And that mystery is kind of inconsequential in the grand scheme of things. Like for me, what the real narrative thread is, like, you know, how is this man grappling with the fact that his wife is dying and that she's basically already gone because she has dementia? And how do you move on from that? And it does that brilliantly. You can decide if, you know, you are going to be kind of cold to the woman on the radio, if you're going to be friendly, if you're going to kind of have an emotional affair with her. Like, I think it does a really great job of giving you the choices to really develop who this person is. There's some brilliant voice acting. It's a beautiful, beautiful world that you're walking through and exploring. And I think it's a perfect example of the show Don't Tell. It is not exposition heavy at all. It's all just about kind of these subtle dialogue choices. Really excellent writing. I love that game.
Interesting. And plus, isn't that game also kind of based on a true story of, like, or I guess a true event from like a forest fire?
I mean, yeah, it's inspired by
Mm-hmm.
some different forest fires.
Yeah, definitely definitely a good choice.
Yeah, yeah.
How about you, Max?
Sorry, can you hear me? My bad.
Yeah, you're good.
Yeah, this is really hard for me. I think there are like sort of I think three different stories that have three different games and their stories that I've really liked, and I'll keep it brief for all of them to not take up too much time. But I'd say the first one, in order of when I've played them in my life. The first one was Fallout 2. I think it just sort of it gives you like just a little bit. You're in a vault. It's post-apocalyptic America. And their water purification system is dying, and you've been chosen to be the one who leaves the vault to go into the post-nuclear apocalyptic America, and go to another vault to find a water chip, so that your vault can keep living. And you just get thrusted out into this world of like doom and hell, but also pockets of hope. Like, because you'll find civilization here, civilization there. That's like sort of slowly starting to rebuild, out in the wasteland. And one of the, I think, best parts about its storytelling is that there are so many different ways you can go about it. You could head in east, west, depending on the direction that you start going. You'll find, this city called Shady Sands, which is like a small village out in the middle of the desert. And there's almost every person in the village has like at least some dialogue to talk to them about. There's Junktown. There's like just so many different locations in this giant world. Just so many different lines of dialogue. So much story to involve yourself in that you can see, you cannot see, depending on how you choose to play the game. There's just a lot of story to be told in a limited game. It came out in what, like 1997, I think. And it's a pretty old game. And honestly, if you were to try to play it nowadays, it's very dated. But I think it's able to tell such an amazing story in ways that, like, can be so different each experience depending on how you go about the game, because there's so many choices, so many different ways you can go about traveling the world, and I think that really got me. That was the game that got me into my favorite genre, which was post-apocalyptic. Any story that's a nuclear post-apocalypse for me is just like I love, purely because of me playing that game when I was younger. I'd say, as far as like show not tell, I think one of my favorite games is Dark Souls. It like gives you nothing. It just says, there are 3 bells, ring the 3 bells, one's up, one's down, and one's east. I think it just says ring 3 bells, one's up, one's down, one's east, and then it leaves you from there. And then the story sort of comes together, like just from how you explore the world. Like you may find a person, they'll have a few lines of dialogue. It gives you nothing, but like, yeah, it gives you so much through the way it builds the world. And that I think is really, it's nice because it really does embody, in my opinion, show not tell, because it's mostly dependent on you, just like how you see the world, how you explore and see the world. And as far as the third game, I don't know if either of you have played this story. If Taylor, I wouldn't be surprised if Taylor's played it. It's a small game on Steam called Her Story.
I haven't played it yet, but it's on my top must play list.
Without going through too much spoilers, basically you are given access to a computer that has a collection of videos and I think maybe even text logs of this woman who is being investigated by the police because her husband is gone missing. And you get it. It's very asynchronous in its storytelling because, you'll find one video that's like near the end of the investigation, and then you get a video that's in the middle, and as you go about the game solving puzzles here and there, you get it in this like very asynchronous way that makes the story like hard to follow yet super engaging.
Really?
Like when I first started it, I was like, it was confusing, and then you're like, oh, stuff starts to click together as you get the different videos, and you start to piece things together in a way that like it makes it more satisfying. I don't know. Instead of giving you like everything in order, there's something about that asynchronous storytelling that I think can be very exciting once you finally are able to piece the clues together yourself. And to prevent any spoilers, I will leave it at that. I think it's definitely well worth the play, Taylor, whenever you get the chance to play it. It's definitely one of my favorite narratives of all time in any game. And fair enough, it's purely about the narrative. So of course you would hope that it would have a good narrative, and it really does. So those, I think, are three different types of games that tell narrative in 3 different ways that I think really encapsulate how video games can vary in their narrative, and how even different styles can still all be amazing in their own ways, right?
Interesting. Thank you on that part. So I guess I like to go into our next topic for storytelling in video games. I like to start off with a little old saying that I have. A video game is good when the video game when you don't play the video game, but the video game plays you. And what I mean by that is, I can explain a scenario of, say, you just completed a game and then you're just kind of like speechless per se, or you feel very moved by it. And I can name a few games off the top of my head that kind of make me feel like that have made me feel that way in some manner, and how storytelling was managed. And I feel like that'd be a good way to go on our next topic. I'll start. What kind of made me go that way, I think, is an obvious good form of storytelling is Undertale. Because I think I went going through Undertale in a certain way of it's just a casual RPG, nothing really interesting surrounding it. But as of course, since Undertale is like the worst kept secret, is that if you treat it like a traditional RPG and fighting monsters and progressing through leveling up, turns out that's a bad thing. And I think it goes to a point where it has 3 separate endings. One bad, one neutral, and then one like good ending. And I think for me that felt. It wasn't until I think I reached. I got a neutral ending at first, and I felt really confused and awestruck that it made me want to play again, which kind of what the game encourages you to. And then when I decided to be actually good this time, and I think it's one of the few. It gives you an entirely different ending, and I think the way it handles its set ending, if you are good per se, it kind of left me crying a little bit in terms of how the story ended, because I think it was just nothing but endorphins kind of just going through me, and all you really feel like I'm sad that it's over, but I'm glad I felt this experience per se. And I think if a game has a very good narrative, it can do that per se. Like another example I got something that's up my head, not trying to double up, is Spider-Man for the PS4. I think that gave me a lot of the most movie-centric vibe, to where it's like one of the best Spider-Man game iterations for Spider-Man out there. Its story is very compelling, and it draws you in so much, where the biggest quote that game has is, "It makes you feel like Spider-Man." And there's a lot of tearjerker moments. There's a lot of great moments. It feels like a super long movie, and it just makes you wanting more. And I think that is just, I think that is like the real power of what storytelling can do.
I think it is the best Spider-Man narrative I've ever experienced. The first Spider-Man for the PS4, easily. I completely agree. It better than any of the movies, better than any of the comics I've read. I'm not a comics expert, but I do dabble in them. I think it is. I agree with you there. It is absolutely amazing.
Mm-hmm. All right. Anyone like to jump in on that?
Yeah. The game that I think had the most emotional impact on me was To the Moon. I cried buckets at the end of that game. It's, the same developer has made some sequels kind of in the same style, but they just haven't affected me the same way. And I think some of that is really the way the narrative unfolds into the moon. So To the Moon was made with RPG Maker. So it looks like, a retro JRPG, but it's not an RPG, it's an adventure game. And you play as a couple scientists who work for a company that goes to people on their deathbeds and changes their memories. So you can have this deathbed wish of, I wish I had done this in my life. And then their memories are changed, so they die happy, believing that they achieved everything that they wanted to achieve.
That's so dark. A little
right?
bit.
Really dark. And so as the scientist, you go to the home of a man who wants to have his memory changed so he can believe that he has gone to the moon or will be an astronaut and can go to the moon. And as the method of doing this is you go into different points in his memories to change things in his life, so he does eventually meet that goal. And you start to learn about his relationship with his wife. And I think it's a really great example of storytelling, of withholding information until the very end. So you think you understand what's happening, and then right at the end, you actually understand what's happening. And it is a gut punch. It is amazing. That game is so good. I cried like uncontrollable buckets at the end of that game. Highly, highly recommended. A game that had a really different emotional impact on me, and I don't know that I've ever had this feeling in a game before, is The Beginner's Guide. I don't know if either of you have heard of this. So it is a game that was made by Davey Bredin, I think is how you say his name. He was one of the developers, creators of the Stanley Parable. And so he did this after the Stanley Parable. And it's presented as he's sharing some unfinished pieces of games that are made by a friend of his. Well, not really a friend, but like a person that he knows who makes games. And they're all these kind of like weird abstract worlds. And it's kind of this commentary on the process of making games. So on the surface, it's this one thing at the beginning, and then it morphs over time into something else. And it left me very deeply unsettled in a way where, like, I think in video games, you don't get a lot of kind of authorial voice. You're not necessarily like feeling the creator in the work, right? Because so many different people work on video games. You know, it's not like an author where you can like kind of make direct linkages to like the author of a book and their personality and their experiences. You know, you find that a little less in video games. And I think in this, like, you really like deeply feel, feel the sort of like tension and confusion that must be going on in Davy Redden's life. It's really interesting. And it's pretty short. It's an experience. You think it's going to be the Stanley Parable, and it's not that.
And you can get this all on PC, correct? Like just
Yes.
trying to cover platforms?
Yeah,
Okay.
on PC. Yep.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. All right. What about you, Max?
As far as a game that really affected me emotionally based on its story, I tend to be very, like, I'm not sure how to explain it, like emotionally separated from these stories. Like I tend not to. Things don't generally. My emotions are not triggered as highly while I'm playing certain games. Games that, like I mentioned earlier, Her Story, that was definitely a game that affected me emotionally, probably because it's one of the most narrative-driven games I've played. That's like pure narrative. It like doesn't even feel like a game. It feels like you're watching a story unfold. Like, while there is some gameplay elements to it. I'd say I remember when one of the first games I ever bought on my own was Dead Space, and that was a game that actually made me definitely very emotional, because I felt I don't know, especially in the first one, less so in the second and the third. But the first one, I really did feel connected to the main character in the search for his wife, and just the general world building of the game as well makes you really connected into the game and make you feel like the main character. But I'm not someone who generally tends to get extremely emotionally affected. Unless I allow myself to get invested, and I generally don't do that.
It's very understandable, because I think very few people when they play video games kind of get that type of feeling per se, and of course I think a great game when it does it on accident, when you least expect it, is a very, very good moment. But it's very hard to put that feeling on purpose when playing a video game. It's like it has to catch you by surprise sometimes, and that's the beauty of it all. But all right, I think we're kind of getting close to time. I think this really flew by really quickly than I thought.
Yeah, right.
All right, before we even say any closing remarks, I mentioned earlier that this was going to be a very special episode towards the Shy Teen Lit Fest. I was wondering, Taylor, if you can provide any more information on that, in case if people are either watching before or after that said event.
Yeah, so Shy Teen Lit Fest is an awesome event, stands for Chicago Teen Literary Festival, and it's a festival made by teens for teens. So you do have to be high school age to attend. This year, it's all virtual because, you know, COVID. It's going to be happening November 6th and 7th. 2020. If you are listening to this after that, keep an eye out for the 2021 Shy Teen Lit Fest dates. But there are going to be all different kinds of panels, meetups, performances, and open mic on the 6th and the 7th. And it covers all things narrative literature storytelling. So journalism, prose, poetry, music, theater, all that stuff, and video games. So Hugo and I will be hosting a meetup, which basically means you can come to it, talk with people who are interested in games just like you, and Hugo and I will help moderate that conversation. So if you're interested in that, the event, so you can find out more at shyteenlitfest.org. And the particular meetup that Hugo and I are doing is called The Art of Storytelling, A Gamer's Tale. And it's going to be from 1:30 to 2:30 on Saturday, November 7th. Make sure to go register on the Shy Teen Lit Fest website, and you'll get all of the info you need to log into Zoom and get into the, right room for the right sessions.
And I'm sure we'll provide as much info on it in the description box below.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you. But yeah, thank you, Taylor. And again, for everyone listening, it'll be a great thing. We'll talk more about what we talked about today in a much deeper manner. Be part of the conversation. I think it's a great time.
Yeah.
All right. So I just want to thank you again, Max, for showing up again. This has been a really great time. I think.
Thanks for having me again. I really appreciate it. Yeah. No.
All right. Without further ado, my name is Hugo. This has been the Library of Games Log In Audio Out podcast, and we are out. Bye.
Bye.